Good evening and welcome. 2020 is going to be an interesting year for Fiji-EU relations, with the Cotonou Agreement, which governs Fiji and the Pacific relations with the EU, coming to an end this year. But what happens after that? To discuss this and more, we have the EU Ambassador to Fiji and the Pacific Islands, His Excellency Sujiro Siem. So good evening, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
Good evening, Nazir, and good evening, Geraldine.
So first of all, let's talk about the Fiji-EU relationship. As the newly appointed ambassador, what expectations or aspirations do you have for the Fiji-EU relationship, and how do you wish to further deepen EU's relationships with Fiji?
Well, listen, let me first of all say that the relationship between the EU and Fiji is very strong. So my only goal is to further develop it, to take it to the next level at the political, economic and development levels. On the political level, our relationship is based on shared values and common interest. I think it's very clear that the values we try to project to the world from the European Union are democracy, human rights and good governance. And in this regard, I think Fiji has gone a long way. There was a successful election 2 years ago. Also, Fiji is the first country to be elected on the Human Rights Council. It is also the first country of the Pacific to have ratified all the core conventions on human rights. When it comes to common interest, I think the EU and Fiji share a common agenda, a very ambitious agenda on climate change, and it shows in the new priorities of the new leadership of the European Union, because right now our top priority is to achieve the European Green Deal, which aims at carbon neutrality by 2050. At the economical level, I think it has been a very good year. I mean, the most brilliant success was certainly the delivery of the A350s to Fiji Airways. You know, those are European planes. But of course, our relationship doesn't stop only on the delivery of new planes, even though they are state-of-the-art and the best planes in the world. But also we can build on our partnership, on our economic partnership agreement, which gives free access to Fijian companies to the single largest free market in the world, the European market. And finally, I know here in the Pacific, the European Union is very much perceived as a development partner, and we're very proud of that. We are, I think, a very significant development partner for Fiji, and our intervention basically focuses on three different areas. The first one is economic development, and in this regard we provide support to the government of Fiji, which is focused on agriculture and rural livelihood. Then we also have a strong cooperation on governance issues, like we have a very good program on access to justice or on the fight against violence against women and girls. And finally, of course, we focus on climate change.
So thank you for that, Ambassador. Looking at some of the things that you had highlighted, of course, yes, the relations between the EU and Fiji is quite strong. But looking at the fourth EU high-level political discussions that took place in Brussels last year, there were a few issues that were highlighted. Looking at the two main ones, the first one being taxation and the second one being the free visa waiver. Could you talk to us about that?
Yes, of course. Our political dialogues take place every year, and it's a good opportunity for the European Union and Fiji to assess the situation, work towards making more progress and advancing our relationship. So, of course, I'm not surprised that you pick up the issues which are a little bit sensitive in our relationship. I think it should not hide the fact that overall our strategic relation with Fiji is excellent. As I said, based on shared values, common interest, a strong economic connection, and also a very strong development relationship. On the two specific issues you mentioned, we know that there are expectations from each other. Certainly on the visa issue, this is a long-standing request from the Fijian government to have free access to the Schengen area in Europe, at least for short stays, which are below 90 days. Fiji is the only country in the Pacific which does not benefit from the Schengen visa waiver agreement with Papua New Guinea and Nauru. And certainly, as the new ambassador of the European Union for the Pacific and for Fiji, it is very high on my priority list, and we will try to achieve a positive outcome in that regard. Let me just say that, of course, the European Union is a complex entity. So even though the institution to which I belong, with the European Commission and the leadership of the European Union, would be willing to table a proposal in the coming months or years, and certainly the fact that we have a new leadership opens new opportunities in that regard. Then we will have to go through a lengthy process to discuss and negotiate and find a compromise with our member states. The other issue you mentioned is taxation. In that particular matter, it's true that the European Union has a regulation, a set of rules on what we call non-cooperative jurisdictions on tax matters. What we are concerned with is twofold when it comes to Fiji. The first series of issues is that Fiji did not accede or does not participate in some of the global instruments and global organization on tax transparency and exchange of information on tax matters. So that's relatively easy to solve. It's just for Fiji to make this move, to join the clubs, which are determined to fight on better tax transparency and to exchange information in that regard. The second series of issues is a little bit more tricky and a little bit more difficult to address. It's what we call harmful tax regimes. Fiji, indeed, in the European views, has some discriminatory tax regimes which benefit foreign direct investors. They are designed, of course, to attract foreign direct investment, but we believe in that area global rules have to be respected so that we ensure fairness and equity at the global level.
So the second issue, unfair tax regimes that you talked about, that's what I'd like to get into a bit more. So the pattern here is that a lot of there were some few Pacific Island countries that have been added to the blacklisted countries. In a statement, Fiji's Revenue and Customs Chief Executive said that the decision by the EU is based on incentive packages that Fiji uses in order to attract and cultivate new businesses, such as moving headquarters to Fiji, thereby urging domestic economic activity and job creation, and as you said, foreign direct investment. So the issue is that especially from the perspective of the EU, is this a one-size-fits-all, that every single country should be following the imposed tax regimes or what the EU wants?
Listen, those are global rules, and it's a little bit like the fight against climate change. If you have free players who do not respect the rules, it causes damage for everyone. Of course, one single country could take advantage of the situation, but that would be to the detriment of others. When it comes to foreign direct investments, of course, foreign direct investors want to invest to make sure that they maximize their rate of return and they maximize their profits. But if there are incentives in one country which do not exist in other countries, then the decision will be a little bit biased, and what benefits one country would be to the detriment of another. So it's the reason why we set it as a global rule, and actually developing countries have the most to gain in that area.
I understand. I hear what you say, and especially since this is such an I guess a sensitive issue, it has garnered a lot of I guess criticism, especially in local social media among local of course experts that we have, and a lot of these people are claiming that these tax incentives and tax regimes were originally used by a lot of countries in order to gain a lot of development, and when Pacific Island economies that are naturally disadvantaged because of their size and their geography wants to do the same, the EU is this huge economic entity that's sort of, I guess, pushing away the ladder for all of these other countries.
Well, let me just say, Nazir, in that regard, of course, we know it's an issue between the European Union and Fiji. We know this is an issue between the European Union and the Pacific, because the matter was taken up by leaders at the Pacific Island Forum leaders meeting in Tuvalu, and the year before already in Nauru. So this is not a new issue. I think positions are clear from the Pacific and from the European Union. I think our position is well set up. I mean, what we want to achieve is global equity and fairness, and you can understand that, of course, it's not a matter when you want to impoverish your neighbors to make yourself richer. So that's the bottom line. I mean,
okay.
You have one jacket. If you wear it, I cannot wear it. Okay? If I give you mine, I don't have mine anymore. So that's what we're talking about. Global rules, global equity, global fairness. Now in the Pacific, we recognize that the capacity to address this set of complex issues is a little bit lower than in other parts of the world. And that's the reason why in the dialogue we have engaged with the Pacific countries which are on our lists. We have offered a dialogue, a more in-depth regular dialogue between our tax authorities and your tax authorities here in Fiji or in other countries in the Pacific, because Fiji is not an isolated case. Also, we can provide technical assistance, so we can bring expertise to have a better understanding of what the expectations are and a better understanding of what needs to be achieved in order to comply with the requirements we try to promote at the global level.
Stay with us. We'll be back after a short break. So, Ambassador, we were talking about visa-free access in the Schengen area, which includes the countries that are included in the European Union. Fiji has, of course, as you're aware, repeatedly made calls and requests for Fiji to be included for as a visa-free state. And you spoke about it a bit in the last segment. So, in terms of a timeline or a road ahead, what needs to happen, and when will it happen?
Well, Nazir, let me just at the outset indicate that visa-free access, of course, is good, but it doesn't solve all the issues about circulation of people between the Pacific and the European Union, because what we're talking about is the waiver, which would give access to Fijian citizens holding a Fijian passport for stays below 90 days. Okay, so that would be for tourist and family visits. That wouldn't address the issue, which are also very important, of people wanting to move to the European Union, for example, for studies, which usually are longer than 90 days, or for the rugby players from Fiji, for example, who would seek employment in the rugby championships in Europe. So even though we would address the issue of visa-free access for short-term visits, I think we would still need to work on visa mechanisms to allow Fijians to go for long stay in Europe. Having said that, on the visa waiver request, I think it is clear that Fiji is willing to put a request to that effect. I committed myself to help Fiji achieve that objective. I think you are very well aware that migration issues are not very easy issues in Europe. Those are very sensitive issues with the large influx of asylum seekers and refugees and migrants to Europe. So it's a very difficult issue to address, not only with the European Union as such, but with our member states. So that's the reason why I think when we talk about deadlines and timeline, we have to factor in the fact that, of course, even if the new leadership of the European Union is willing to put a proposal on the table, then it will take months, if not years, for the member states to agree, because that's normally the duration of the processes we're contemplating within the EU before we can reach a final decision. No? So my goal would be in the next 4 years, as I'm starting this position for the next 4 years, to try to achieve that process, to have this request considered by the European Union and then negotiated among member states. Of course, it's totally impossible to predict the final outcome, because this will be the result of this negotiation between member states. Let me just conclude on that point by saying that Fiji is not the problem. We do not have an issue with visa waiver agreement with Fiji. The problem is that when you have a proposal put forward by the European Commission and considered by the European Council of Member States, Fiji will not be the only country which will be willing to be on the list. So we will have other countries which will be more sensitive for the European Union. And unfortunately, it will be a package deal. This is not, I think it's not possible for us to consider just a single request for Fiji. So even if we recognize, and certainly those are the messages I pass to my headquarters, there is no migratory risk. It's not like other countries where visa holders have a strong temptation to overstay the visa and become illegal immigrants. I think for Fiji the risk is very low. But nonetheless, because Fiji will be considered in a package with other countries which will be more sensitive, that might introduce some delays and push the deadlines.
So if we talk about the fifth high-level political dialogue between the EU and Fiji, which is due to take place in Suva to sort of, I guess, replace the Cotonou Agreement, what's on the agenda for this meeting?
Well, those Cotonou Agreement and high-level political dialogue are linked but separate issues. The high-level political dialogue between the European Union and the members of the Cotonou Agreement is foreseen in the Cotonou Agreement, indeed. So we have one every year with Fiji. We alternate between Fiji and Brussels. Last year it was held in Brussels, so this year, of course, it will be held and organized and hosted here in Fiji, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Under the Cotonou Agreement, the high-level political dialogue is a unique opportunity once a year to meet at the highest possible level. So usually the Honorable Prime Minister of Fiji opens the political dialogue, and then the political dialogue itself is conducted by the line ministers. So, of course, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and National Security would have a big role to play, but because we're considering issues pertaining to taxation and visa, also the Ministry for Economy will have a very strong role to play. For us, it's an annual meeting which allows us to take stock of the progress made and also to draw the roadmap, if you want, towards what we want to do in the future. I think for this year in the fifth high-level political dialogue, I would see at least 3 or 4 issues which would be on the top of the agenda. There are the 2 that we have already discussed. How we can remove Fiji from the blacklist on tax matters, because let me be 100% clear on that. My goal is to remove Fiji from that list. The second issue would be how we can make progress to deliver on this request, which is an old request from Fiji, to be benefiting from a visa waiver agreement. The third issue, because you mentioned the Cotonou Agreement, and it's true that not only the Cotonou Agreement comes to an end, but also our current programming on development assistance comes to an end. So we have to discuss the next generation of development projects, and that would be the third issue, I presume. The in-depth discussion that we have to engage with the government of Fiji and colleagues in the European Union to select and prioritize areas where we want to collaborate in the future on development issues. Then, of course, there are many other issues. For example, we have with Fiji this economic partnership agreement, but we still need to discuss how we want to implement that, how we want to support the private sector, how we want to provide aid for trade or trade facilitation measures, how we want to strengthen value chains, in which areas we want to strengthen value chains to maximize the benefits of the economic partnership agreement between Fiji and the European Union. So as you can see, we will have a very full agenda.
Let's move on to some issues like climate change, and I'm guessing climate change is also an important issue, obviously, to Fiji. We're on the front line in terms of the effects of climate change, and the EU as a whole has taken a very strong stance on climate change as well, more so than a lot of other developed countries. So especially given the way that it affects Fijians and the Pacific in general, talk to us about what the EU Green Deal is, which you mentioned earlier.
Yes,
and
certainly.
How does this respond or help in the global efforts to fight climate change?
Well, I have to say personally, I'm very happy that the new leadership of the European Union put the European Green Deal on the top of its priority lists. The European Green Deal, it's not only a motto, it's not only a slogan, it's not only a concept, and the European Union has just laid out the plan of what it means. I think the first element is really about carbon neutrality. So we have this very ambitious goal to reach zero net emission by 2050. And although other countries in the world have already indicated their ambition to reach that objective of carbon neutrality, I think this new push from the European Union to date is the most ambitious one because of the size of the European Union. I mean, we recognize that Fiji or the Marshall Islands or New Zealand are walking that path as well, but it will be more impactful if it comes from the European Union because of our contribution to climate change. The second element in this Green Deal It's really about biodiversity, because we consider that climate change and biodiversity go hand in hand. So the intention from the European Union is to have a full-fledged new strategy for biodiversity. And you know that biodiversity will be a very hot topic for 2020, because we will attend at the end of the year the 15th Conference of the Parties on the Convention of Biodiversity, and that will be in China. The third element would be about clean technologies. We recognize that to move towards a low-carbon economy, towards a carbon-neutral economy, we will have to be more ambitious and implement and disseminate new technologies. So there will be a big push from the European Union on clean technologies. And finally, I would say the fourth element in this Green Deal is about an issue which is also a plague in the Pacific and in Fiji. It's about waste. So our response to waste would be to promote circular economy, how we can reduce, reuse, and recycle from the design up to the usage. So not only on the consumption side, but also on the production side. Of course, I'm in Fiji, so I witnessed firsthand the controversy about the implementation and the plastic ban, for example. The plastic ban will be necessary, but there will be other measures which will be necessary to promote the circular economy and to make sure that we decrease the impact waste have on the planet.
You know, a lot of people would say that Fiji is really punching above its weight in terms of climate advocacy. My interest is more on a global level, especially with the EU and other developed countries. So many developed countries actually going back on their commitments, those made under the Paris Agreement. So many countries not honoring their agreements. What's the scope for EU leadership and the willingness from EU leadership to work with some of these bigger polluters?
Ambassador Siem, if you wouldn't mind, maybe we could pick this up when we come back from break.
We'll let you answer that question when we come back from our break. Stay with us. Ambassador, when we left off in the last segment, we were talking about the willingness and scope for EU leaders to work with some of the bigger polluters out there.
Well, listen, I think our strategy is really simple. We want to lead by example, and we want to lead from the front. We want to lead by example, which means that we have to do our share. We cannot force others to do their shares, because this is an international issue. It's about advocacy and it's about convincing. But we have to show that it is possible to address the matter in a very ambitious way, and that's the second element of it. Leading by example is not enough. You have to do the right thing, but you have to have high ambitions, and that's what we do. I think, again, the European Union is, to date, the single largest contributor to climate change, to fully embrace this extremely ambitious goal, but which will be necessary to achieve the Paris Agreement objectives of carbon neutrality by 2050. And we lead by example because we know it's not an easy task, but we try to devise a comprehensive plan with a full set of resources and means associated to it. So I think it will have a positive spillover effect on others. And in the meantime, we will continue to engage with everyone, including with the countries which are not so keen on delivering on the Paris Agreement. And in that regard, I have to say, from COP15 from COP21 in Paris in 2015, I think there was this very wise decision to discuss climate change issues not only with government, but also with non-state actors. So even in countries where there is a reluctance from the government to act on climate change, it doesn't mean that we're empty-handed. Even in countries where the government doesn't want to address the issue to the full extent of what is required to abide by the Paris Agreement, we can work with non-state actors. We can work with cities. We can work with federate states in the US, for example. We can work with the private sector. We can work with academia. We can work with the civil society. So I would say it's a mixture of this, leading by example, leading from the front, and working with everyone.
Let's move on to discussing the Cotonou Agreement.
So, like you had mentioned earlier, and we had, of course, alluded to it, the Cotonou Agreement currently governing the EU and the ACP relations is due to expire this year. Looking at this particular agreement, how is it different from the Cotonou Agreement, and what can we expect from it?
Well, you know, the European Union has had a very long and fruitful relationship with the countries from Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. That's what the ACP means. There are 79 of them. And the Cotonou Agreement was signed and entered into effect 20 years ago. So those are long agreements for 20 years, but it comes to an end. So we have to agree now on the next generation coming after the Cotonou Agreement. The first thing I have to say about that is the negotiation is going well. We're making steady progress, so we're hopeful that we can reach a conclusion by the end of this year. And the second element is that for the first time ever, the ACP ministers, the ACP leaders, decided to have the signing ceremony of this framework agreement between the European Union and the ACP countries here in the Pacific. They selected Apia in Samoa as the signing location. That will be the first time ever that it is not in a country in Africa. Because Cotonou is the capital of Benin, but before it was in Lomé, Togo, and before it was in Yaoundé, Cameroon, all African countries. Now, speaking to the substance of this agreement, I think the main change will be the new architecture that we envision for the framework between the European Union and the countries from Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. We will have, on the one hand, a foundation agreement, which would be working for all the 79 ACP countries, and associated to that we will have 3 geographical protocols, including a specific protocol for the Pacific. So I think that's the main innovation. Now, when it comes to what we are discussing and what we have almost agreed, actually, the priorities are set. There will be 6 of them, 1 on peace and security, 1 on human rights, democracy and good governance, 1 on human and social development, 1 on inclusive and sustainable growth and economic development, 1 on environment sustainability and climate change, and 1 on migration. So the 6 areas where we have to cooperate between the EU and the countries from the ACP are well determined. Now, I mentioned this innovation of having not only a foundation agreement for everyone, but also regional protocols. The leaders in the Pacific are participating in the global negotiation. The region is represented by Papua New Guinea and Samoa, and we've made good progress. We had a good dialogue last year, a year ago in Samoa, and another negotiating session here in Fiji. And I think one of the main achievements is to recognize that in the Pacific there is a need for a specific chapter on climate and oceans, which are unique areas of interest for the Pacific.
You know, a lot of academics would I guess, echo your call to have, I guess, solutions tailored for the region, because the ACP is a big umbrella. And even within the Pacific region, let's say if you compare Fiji and Papua New Guinea, or Fiji and the islands of Kiribati, a lot of issues that affect one Pacific island country are not necessarily those that affect another. So I'm just guessing, I'm just trying to ask what the scope is for making, I guess, tailor-made solutions for each and every Pacific region.
Well, I would say, Nazir, it's a 3-stage approach we have here. We have the foundation agreement, again, that works for everyone, the 79. Then we will have the Pacific Protocol, which would work for the Pacific, and it will respond to the specific needs of the region as identified by leaders of the region. So the Blue Pacific strategy, the ocean dimension, the climate change priority are well embedded into the regional protocol. But afterwards, we mentioned the political dialogue, and we mentioned the specific relationship between the European Union and Fiji, and that's where it comes into play at the last stage of this 3-stage approach. We will have a country-specific approach. It will be within the framework of the post-Cotonou Agreement or the Samoa Agreement, if it is signed in Samoa. But that's the reason why we need now to engage in a discussion with each of the countries, taking into account the priorities and the new setup of the post-Cotonou Agreement, to identify specific areas of interest and cooperation between the European Union and let's say, Fiji in that regard. But, you know, as the ambassador of the European Union for the Pacific, I have responsibilities for 13 countries, so we have to do it for each and every one of the countries. And there, of course, we mentioned Fiji already, so it's clear that we will have to address the issues of priority concern like taxation, like the visa waiver agreement, like the programming for the next generation of programs, like the implementation of the economic partnership agreements. So that's where the tailor-made measures can occur.
Stay with us, we'll have more for you right after the break. So let's talk about trade relations between Fiji and EU, especially in the field of agriculture. In 2017, your predecessor mentioned that the European Union had a total of approximately 45 million or 20 million euros in aid, or rather in trade, to support the agricultural sector in Fiji, and that preparation of this program is ongoing in close cooperation with the government as well. So we'd just like to get an update on this and what's happened.
Yes, those are actually two separate issues, Nazir. We have development on one side and trade on the other side. Of course, they might be interconnected, because if we provide development assistance, it will allow Fiji to increase its capacity to export and trade with the rest of the world, including with the European Union. But on the development side, we have three different areas of intervention. The first one is the budget support we provide to the government of Fiji. Budget support is money transferred from the European Development Fund directly to the government of Fiji, and it is spent on an area which is identified and prioritized by the government of Fiji. In the past, it was sugar. Now it is agriculture and rural livelihoods, so it's still agriculture but broader than sugar. And there are the 20 million euros, or now 50 million Fijian dollars, you were referring to. So we're making good progress on the implementation of that specific budget support. The second area where we try to provide development assistance is governance. So we have projects to improve access to justice, and we work with the judiciary power here in Fiji. We work with the legal aid office. We work with the commissioner of police. We work with the commissioner of prisons, and we try to improve governance in that area. We also have a strong program on democracy consolidation, on support to the civil society, in particular in the area of violence against women and girls. And finally, we have this third package, which is really designed to address climate change and to increase resilience, preparedness to natural disasters, and the capacity of Fiji to face the consequences of climate change in this part of the world. Now, when it comes to trade, the main instrument we have is the Economic Partnership Agreement, which is a trade agreement, but more than a trade agreement. It gives free access without duties or without quota restrictions for Fijian businesses to the European market. In the other direction, I think my role is also to promote Fiji as a destination for business and trade and investment for European companies. So here, of course, we all know that Fiji is a large market for the Pacific, almost 1 million people. It's also a mature market, because what we export to Fiji, it's mainly equipment, machinery, vehicles, aircrafts, so that's high technology content products. I think there is scope to do more. So I was the other day at an event at the French residence here to celebrate the arrival in Fiji of a new French brand of cars, Renault. I drive myself with the delegation of Volkswagen, but I think we see more of non-European cars here in Fiji, so there is scope for progress in that regard. And we have already mentioned the Airbus, but that's a high technological content. That's good for the European Union, but that's also good for Fiji, because that would allow Fiji Airways and Fiji as a country to reach the next stage of its development. So that's what we're trying to achieve, to not only encourage exports from Fiji to the European market, but also trade flux from the European Union to Fiji.
So because of so many things that you mentioned, it is Really an exciting time to see what's happening with the Fiji-EU relationship. But I'd also like to discuss, the scope for more relations going into the future. Is the EU starting to realize that, Fiji and the Pacific can offer serious trade and business to the EU, and vice versa, despite the vast geographical distance differences?
There is a lot of room for improvement. Right now, if you look at the statistics, what we export to Fiji has high technological content. I mentioned equipment, machinery, cars and aircrafts. What we import, it's mainly raw products. Our main import is sugar, then we also import water, and finally we import fish. I think there is scope for more imports of products from Fiji to the European Union, despite the distance. It's a matter for Fiji to identify the niche markets where it would make the difference in the European market.
Pardon my interruption, Ambassador, but you mentioned trade and you also mentioned a few of the exports that Fiji has. But in recent years, we've seen the trend that one of the biggest industries in Fiji is, of course, tourism. Any work or anything in progress for maybe trying to encourage more tourism from the EU and people from those areas to come into the country. Visitor arrivals have been pretty low from those areas in the past few years.
Right. Well, tourism is not really an area where the European delegation for the Pacific has a lot to contribute, because this is really an area where it's primarily for Fiji to market the country as a destination. I think our leverage on exports of products is higher, in particular because our trade agreement only covers products, trade in goods, not trade in services at this stage. That might come later. But before we have this agreement covering services, including tourism, I think our room for maneuver in that area is pretty limited. Let me just say, however, that with these new airplanes, that will boost tourism in Fiji, of course. So that's a sort of indirect contribution to the development of tourism in Fiji. Also, with the exports of equipment and machinery, it will contribute to the general development of Fiji, and that will have a positive spillover effect on its capacity to attract tourists. We just have to recognize that the European Union is a very far away market for Fiji, because of the distance and the time and therefore the cost to reach Fiji. We have tourists, but I think it would not be very reasonable to consider that suddenly European tourists will be a primary source of revenue and income for the Fijian market.
We're with His Excellency, the EU Ambassador to Fiji, and when we come back from break, we'll have our final segment. Stay with us. Ambassador, let's move on to some global affairs in our last segment.
Certainly, Nazir.
The EU, both as an economic and political powerhouse, I guess, of the globe, is involved in a lot of political affairs on a global level. But let's talk about some stuff that's happening within the EU, especially Brexit, something that everyone's talking about, and the way that it can, I guess, affect the future of the EU. Would you like to comment on that?
No, I would not. But as you asked the question, I think the best way to capture it is what the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, declared when she met with the Honourable Prime Minister of the United Kingdom when they met in London earlier this month. The UK is an old friend, and we have to work on a new relationship.
And that's all you're prepared to say for now?
I think it's still very unclear what the relationship will be after the UK exits the European Union by the 31st of January of this year, because discussions are still ongoing on how we will manage this new relationship with an old friend.
In your time in Fiji, you must have noticed the way that Fiji has been influenced by China's growing presence. And China does have a growing presence, not only in Fiji, but around the Pacific as well. Does that concern the EU?
Well, the EU has the ambition to be a global player. So we have relationships with all the countries in the world, especially with the big countries. So we have a relationship with the United States, of course. We have a relationship with China. It goes without saying. We have diplomatic relationship with China. We cooperate with China on many different issues, from economic matters to climate change to biodiversity. I think I mentioned already that this year the Conference of the Parties on the Convention on Biodiversity will be hosted by China. So we are particularly looking forward to cooperating with China on biodiversity. Having said that, with the Pacific, I know this is an area for strategic competitions between countries. It's not a secret for anyone that this strategic competition involves China, that it has been increasing in the past, with in particular this competition between China and Taiwan. And in that regard, let me just say that, of course, we have this diplomatic relationship with China. We also cooperate with Taiwan because we are like-minded on many issues, including democracy, human rights, good governance, or fair economic relations. So this is the stance we will be taking. I mean, we're not taking sides because we're not required to take side. As a global power, we can go for our own path. And our own path is to increase and develop the strategic relation we have with the Pacific as a region.
Just to wrap this up, Ambassador Sim, what activities does the delegation have for locals this year?
Well, I recognize that the European Union is at the same time a well-known entity and quite a mystery for Fijian people. So I think it's important for us to engage more with the population of Fiji, with the people of Fiji, and to have more events to raise the profile of the European Union in this country. To that effect, I think our flagship events are the celebration of May the 9th as the Day of Europe. We focus on universities on that day. We have this famous university quiz where universities in Fiji compete on their knowledge on the European Union with some good prizes to award. We also have a film festival. We had a film festival on human rights, which is one of the core values of the European Union, but we will have a European Film Festival, so this will be an innovation for this year. And we also organize a beach cleanup, because you know the commitment we have to climate change and oceans. I think for this year, what I will try to achieve, compared to what we have done in the past, is to focus more on youth. The last beach cleanup we had here in Suva was organized in partnership with the Ministry of Youth, and we will build up on this relationship so that we can more engage the youth of Fiji to increase their knowledge and their willingness to do things with us, with the European Union.
Ambassador, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. We wish you all the best and thank you for joining us, and we hope to have you back someday.
Well, thank you very much, Nazir, and thank you very much, Geraldine.
And that's all we have time for on the show tonight. Join us again next week. Have a good evening.